Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Hamilton County, Tennessee. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1883 in the hills of southeastern Tennessee was particularly harsh. Snow had fallen earlier than usual that year, blanketing the remote valleys and winding creek beds that carved through Hamilton County like scars on weathered skin. For the scattered families living in the hollows and ridges, winter meant isolation, long nights, and the kind of silence that could drive a person to madness if they weren't careful. The Haldenberg family had chosen their isolation deliberately. Caspar Haldenberg, a man of German descent in his late 40s, had purchased 200 acres of rough mountain land 3 miles northeast of Signal Mountain in the spring of 1881. The property included a modest 2-story farmhouse built sometime in the 1850s, a barn that leaned precariously toward the creek, and enough cleared land to sustain a small family through careful farming and hunting. According to the Hamilton County land records, preserved in the courthouse basement until their transfer to the state archives in 1956, Caspar had paid for the property entirely in cash, an unusual transaction that raised questions among local officials, but was ultimately accepted without investigation. The previous owner, a widower named Jeremiah Caldwell, had been eager to sell after living alone on the property for nearly 15 years following his wife's death from consumption. Caldwell's decision to sell had been influenced by what he described in his correspondence with the county clerk as unnatural disturbances that had increased in frequency during his final years on the property. These disturbances, according to Caldwell's written testimony, included the sound of voices speaking in foreign languages during nighttime hours, the discovery of carefully arranged stones in geometric patterns throughout the property, and the repeated appearance of symbols carved into the bark of various trees surrounding the house. Caspar lived on the property with his wife Ingrid, a woman described by the few neighbors who knew her as possessing an almost supernatural stillness about her movements and expressions. She was 38 years old, tall and angular, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. The couple had been married for nearly 20 years, though no record exists of any offspring from their union, a circumstance that generated quiet speculation among the local community, but was never directly addressed by the family themselves. Ingrid's background remained largely mysterious to their Tennessee neighbors. Church records from the Lutheran congregation in Soddy Daisy indicate that she spoke with a slight accent that suggested European origins, but she rarely participated in social conversations that might have revealed specific details about her past. Pastor Heinrich Müller, in his private correspondence with other clergy members, described her as a woman who seemed to carry the weight of significant loss, though she never spoke of what that loss might have been. Also residing in the household was Caspar's younger brother Matthias, who had arrived from Pennsylvania in late 1882. Matthias was different from his older brother in nearly every way. Where Caspar was methodical and reserved, Matthias possessed a nervous energy that manifested in constant fidgeting and an inability to maintain eye contact during conversations. Local records from the general store in Signal Mountain indicate that Matthias made weekly trips into town for supplies, always paying in cash and rarely speaking beyond the bare necessities of commerce. Store owner Jeremiah Walsh, in a statement provided to investigators in March 1883, described Matthias as a man who seemed to be listening for something that no one else could hear. He would stop in the middle of conversations, tilt his head as if catching a distant sound, and then continue as if nothing had happened. More than once I observed him standing motionless in the store, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the walls, until I called his name multiple times to bring him back to the present moment. The final member of the household was Ingrid's elderly uncle, Bernhard Krause, a man in his 70s who had lived with the family since shortly after their arrival in Tennessee. Bernhard was partially deaf and suffered from what contemporary medical records described as episodes of confusion and disorientation. Despite his limitations, he was known to possess an uncanny ability to read the weather and predict changes in the local wildlife patterns. Dr. Cornelius Hoffman, who maintained a small medical practice serving the rural communities around Signal Mountain, treated Bernhard on several occasions for various age-related ailments. In his patient notes, discovered in his medical bag after his own mysterious disappearance in 1884, Dr. Hoffman recorded his observations about Bernhard's condition. The patient exhibits signs of significant mental deterioration consistent with advanced age, but demonstrates remarkable lucidity when discussing specific topics related to his European background. He frequently mentions the old arrangements and family obligations that suggest involvement in some form of ongoing legal or financial commitment. When pressed for details, he becomes agitated and reverts to speaking German, despite otherwise communicating effectively in English. For nearly 2 years, the Haldenberg family lived quietly in their mountain hollow. They attended church sporadically at the small Lutheran congregation in Soddy Daisy, contributed minimally to community gatherings, and maintained the kind of cordial but distant relationships typical of mountain families who valued their privacy above social connections. However, several community members noted subtle aspects of the family's behavior that distinguished them from other reclusive mountain dwellers. Margaret Crenshaw, whose family operated the general store at the crossroads, serving several remote communities, observed that the Haldenberg family's purchasing patterns followed unusual cycles that seemed to correspond with lunar phases and specific calendar dates. They would appear in town on the same dates each month, Mrs. Crenshaw later told investigators, always purchasing identical combinations of supplies, lamp oil, writing paper, sealing wax, and specific medicinal herbs that we had to special order from suppliers in Chattanooga. The amounts they purchased suggested they were either hosting regular gatherings or shipping materials to other locations. Mrs. Crenshaw also noted that Matthias occasionally received mail through the store's postal service, letters that arrived with postmarks from various locations throughout Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas. The letters were always addressed in identical handwriting, despite originating from different cities, and Matthias always destroyed them immediately after reading, burning the paper in the store's heating stove before leaving the premises. The Haldenberg property itself showed signs of modifications that puzzled neighbors and occasional visitors. Ezra Whitman, whose farm lay approximately 1 mile south of the Haldenberg place, reported that he had frequently observed construction activity around the house during late nighttime hours. When asked to describe this activity, Whitman explained that he had seen lights moving between the house and various outbuildings, accompanied by the sounds of digging and the movement of heavy materials. It wasn't normal construction work, Whitman told investigators. Normal folks don't build foundations and dig root cellars in the middle of the night, and they don't transport materials without using roads or making tracks that can be seen the next day. But I'd see those lights moving around their property 3 or 4 nights each month, always when the moon was dark. And the next morning there'd be no evidence of what they'd been doing. The ground would be smooth, the grass undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. Whitman also described an encounter with Caspar Haldenberg that had occurred in early December 1882. While hunting deer near the creek that separated their properties, Whitman had come upon Caspar engaged in what appeared to be a surveying activity, using instruments and making measurements around a large oak tree that stood in a small clearing approximately half a mile from the house. He had equipment I'd never seen before, Whitman recounted to investigators, not the simple tools a farmer would use to mark property lines or plan crop plantings. These were precise instruments the kind that railroad engineers or government surveyors might carry. He was making calculations, taking measurements, and recording everything in a leather-bound book. When he noticed me watching, he closed the book immediately and greeted me politely, but I could see that my presence had disturbed whatever he was doing. The surveying activity around the oak tree proved to be significant when investigators later discovered that the tree marked the center of a complex network of underground passages that connected the Haldenberg property to similar installations on at least 4 neighboring farms. The passages, constructed with sophisticated engineering techniques, allowed for movement between widely separated locations without using surface roads or leaving visible tracks. The first indication that something was amiss came on February 14, 1883, when Pastor Heinrich Miller arrived at the Haldenberg property for what was intended to be a routine pastoral visit. Pastor Miller, a meticulous man who kept detailed records of his congregation's spiritual and temporal welfare, had been concerned about the family's absence from services for 3 consecutive Sundays. Pastor Muller's journey to the Haldenberg property on that Valentine's Day involved a difficult ride through snow-covered mountain trails that tested both his physical endurance and his dedication to pastoral duty. In his personal journal, preserved in the Lutheran Church archives, he recorded his impressions of the approach to the house. The snow around the property showed signs of recent activity, with multiple sets of footprints and what appeared to be wagon tracks leading to and from the house. However, the patterns of these tracks were unusual, suggesting that several people had walked in single file along the same precise route, as if following instructions to minimize their visible impact on the landscape. The scene that greeted Pastor Muller that Valentine's Day would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The farmhouse appeared undisturbed from the outside. Smoke rose from the chimney, and fresh tracks in the snow indicated recent human activity around the property. However, when the pastor knocked on the front door, he was met with a silence that seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical weight. After waiting for nearly 10 minutes in the bitter cold, Pastor Muller walked around the house, peering through windows and calling out the names of the family members. In the parlor window he observed what appeared to be the normal furnishings of a lived-in home, chairs arranged around a small table, a Bible open on a side table, and a partially completed piece of needlework resting in Ingrid's sewing basket. However, closer examination revealed that the Bible was open to a specific passage in the book of Exodus dealing with the departure of the Israelites from Egypt, and the needlework depicted a pattern that seemed to represent a map or diagram rather than a decorative design. The kitchen window revealed a more puzzling scene. The table was set for 4 people, with plates, cups, and cutlery arranged as if for a meal. A large pot sat on the stove, though no heat emanated from the cooking surface. Most disturbing to Pastor Muller was the fact that the 4 chairs around the table were pulled back slightly, as if the occupants had just stood up from their seats simultaneously. Unable to gain entry through conventional means, Pastor Muller retrieved a ladder from the barn and managed to peer through an upstairs window. What he saw in the main bedroom defied easy explanation. The bed was made with military precision, but on top of the coverlet lay 4 sets of clothing, arranged as if invisible bodies were wearing them. Casper's work clothes, Ingrid's Sunday dress, Matthias's traveling outfit, and what appeared to be Bernhard's nightshirt were all laid out in perfect human forms, complete with shoes positioned at the foot of the bed. Pastor Miller's subsequent report to the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department described a profound sense of wrongness about the entire scene. In his own words, documented in the case file that would eventually be archived and largely forgotten, it was as if the family had simply stepped out of their clothing and vanished into the winter air. But the careful arrangement suggested something far more deliberate than a sudden departure. The clothing was positioned with the kind of precision that spoke of ritual or ceremony, as if the act of removal had been performed according to specific instructions or traditions. Sheriff Josiah Whitmore and his deputy, Samuel Reed, arrived at the property the following morning with a locksmith from Chattanooga. The locksmith, a German immigrant named Friedrich Weber, later provided investigators with additional details about the condition of the house that had not been apparent to Pastor Miller during his external examination. The locks on all the doors had been carefully oiled and maintained, Weber told investigators. This was not a house that had been abandoned hastily. Someone had taken time to ensure that all the mechanical systems were in proper working order. The front door lock showed no signs of forced entry, but there were scratches around the keyhole that suggested it had been locked and unlocked multiple times in recent days. Weber also noted that the house contained several locks that were not standard residential hardware, hidden behind furniture and installed in inconspicuous locations. These additional locks secured access to spaces that were not immediately visible to casual observers. Some of the locks were designed to secure panels in the walls that concealed storage compartments, while others protected access to staircases that led to areas of the house that did not appear on the original architectural plans. The interior of the house presented even more disturbing evidence of the family's inexplicable disappearance. The kitchen held the remains of what appeared to be a partially prepared meal. Vegetables sat chopped on a cutting board, their edges brown with oxidation. The pot on the stove contained water and potatoes that had begun to show signs of decomposition. Most puzzling was the discovery of 4 plates of food, untouched but covered with several days' worth of dust, and the beginning stages of mold growth. However, the food itself told a more complex story than simple abandonment. Dr. Augustus Fleming, the county coroner who was called to examine the scene, noted that the meals had been prepared according to specific dietary traditions that were not typical of rural Tennessee. The combination of ingredients suggested knowledge of European folk traditions related to ritualistic consumption, Dr. Fleming recorded in his official report. The presence of specific herbs and the arrangement of the food on the plates indicated that this meal had been prepared for a purpose beyond simple nutrition. In the parlor, investigators found Ingrid's needlework exactly as Pastor Muller had described it, but with an addition that had not been visible from outside. Beside the sewing basket lay a letter, addressed in Ingrid's careful handwriting to Pastor Miller himself. The letter was dated February 10th, 4 days before the pastor's visit, and was sealed with red wax that bore the impression of a symbol that none of the investigators could identify. The contents of that letter, preserved in the county archives, read, "Dear Pastor Muller, by the time you read these words, we will have fulfilled our obligation to the covenant that has governed our family for longer than you might imagine. Please do not grieve for us, nor attempt to understand what cannot be understood by those outside our particular burden. The arrangement we have maintained here was always temporary, a way station rather than a permanent home. We ask only that you pray for the peace of our souls and ensure that our property is distributed according to the instructions contained in the sealed envelope hidden behind the loose stone in the cellar wall." The letter continued with specific directions for locating the hidden envelope, including detailed measurements and reference points that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the house's construction. More unsettling was a postscript written in a different hand that investigators later determined belonged to Matthias. The obligations of the living extend beyond the obligations of the dead. What we have learned here must be preserved and transmitted to those who will continue the work. The arrangements have been made, and the transfers will proceed according to the established schedule. Sheriff Whitmore's investigation team discovered the mentioned envelope in exactly the location described in Ingrid's letter. The loose stone that concealed the hiding place showed evidence of frequent removal and replacement, suggesting that the family had accessed this cache repeatedly during their time in Tennessee. Inside was a handwritten will dated February 8, 1883, distributing the family's modest assets among various Lutheran charities and designating Pastor Muller as the executor of the estate. More disturbing was a second document in the same envelope, a detailed list of what appeared to be monthly monetary payments made to an entity identified only as the arrangement dating back to 1881. The payments, recorded in Casper's precise handwriting, began at $20 per month and increased incrementally to nearly $50 by January 1883. Beside each payment entry was a single word or phrase: silence maintained, terms honored, no questions asked, or simply satisfied. The final entry, dated February 9th, read, final payment rendered, terms of covenant fulfilled, family released from further obligation, transfer to Western facility authorized, new identities confirmed, previous existence terminated. A third document, written in a code that would not be deciphered until decades later, contained what appeared to be detailed instructions for the disposal of the property and the elimination of any evidence that might connect the Haldenberg family to their previous identities or their involvement with the arrangement. The instructions included specific procedures for cleaning the house, arranging the abandoned clothing, and preparing the misleading evidence that would guide investigators toward incorrect conclusions about the family's disappearance. A thorough search of the house and surrounding property revealed no signs of violence, struggle, or hasty departure. The family's clothing remained in their wardrobes and drawers, with only the 4 outfits found arranged on the bed missing from the household inventory. Personal items, including Casper's pocket watch, Ingrid's wedding ring, and a small amount of cash, remained undisturbed in their usual locations. However, investigators did discover several items that suggested the family had been preparing for their departure for some time. Hidden throughout the house were small caches of traveling supplies, preserved food, water containers, warm clothing, and currency from various states. These supplies were carefully distributed and concealed, indicating that the family had developed detailed contingency plans for rapid evacuation if circumstances required immediate departure. Most intriguing was the discovery of a hidden compartment behind the fireplace in the main bedroom. This compartment contained documents that revealed the true extent of the Haldenberg family's involvement with the arrangement and provided the first detailed glimpse into the organization's structure and operations. The documents, written in multiple hands and languages, described a network of families throughout the southeastern United States who were connected by shared obligations to assist each other in maintaining new identities and avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies. The network operated through a complex system of safe houses, communication routes, and financial transactions that allowed members to disappear from one location and reappear in another with complete new identities. According to these documents, the Haldenberg family had been part of the arrangement since at least 1878, when they first arrived in the United States from what was then Prussia. Their original identities, revealed in partially decoded letters, suggested that they had fled Europe to escape prosecution related to their involvement in revolutionary political activities that had made them targets of government persecution. The arrangement had provided them with new identities and helped them establish themselves in Pennsylvania, where they lived for 3 years before being relocated to Tennessee. Each relocation involved the complete abandonment of their previous identities and the creation of entirely new personal histories, complete with forged documents, fabricated relationships, and carefully constructed legends that explained their presence in each new community. The Tennessee relocation, according to the documents, had been necessitated by increased scrutiny from federal law enforcement agencies that were investigating immigrant communities suspected of harboring political radicals. The arrangement had determined that several families, including the Haldenbergs, needed to be moved to more remote locations where they could maintain their cover identities without attracting unwanted attention. The investigation expanded to include interviews with a few neighbors within walking distance of the Haldenberg property. These conversations revealed a pattern of odd behavior from the family that had escalated in the months leading up to their disappearance. More importantly, the interviews uncovered evidence of a much larger network of unusual activities involving multiple families throughout the region. Ezra Whitman, whose farm lay approximately 1 mile south of the Haldenberg place, provided the most detailed account of the strange activities he had observed over the previous year. It wasn't just the Haldenbergs, Whitman told investigators. There were at least 6 other families in these mountains who seemed to be involved in whatever was happening. You'd see them moving between properties at night, always traveling in small groups, always avoiding the main roads. Whitman described a network of communication that connected the various properties through a system of light signals and message drops. On specific nights each month, families would display lantern signals from elevated positions on their properties, creating a chain of communication that could transmit messages across distances of many miles without requiring direct contact between the participants. They had it worked out so a message could travel from the Haldenberg place to properties 20 miles away in less than 2 hours, Whitman explained. Each family would receive the signal, decode whatever information it contained, and pass it along to the next link in the chain. Most of the time, we regular folks had no idea this communication system even existed. Whitman also described an encounter with Matthias Haldenberg that had occurred in early January 1883. While checking his trap lines near the creek that separated their properties, Whitman had come upon Matthias standing motionless in the center of a small clearing, staring up at the bare branches of an enormous oak tree. He stood there for the better part of an hour without moving a muscle, Whitman recounted. I called out to him twice, thinking he might be hurt or lost, but he never acknowledged my presence, just stood there like a statue, looking up at that tree as if it held the secrets of the universe. When I finally approached close enough to touch his shoulder, he turned to me with the most peaceful expression I've ever seen on a man's face and said, "It's almost time, Ezra. We've learned to listen to what the silence teaches." Then he walked away toward his house without another word. Whitman's description of the oak tree led investigators to examine the site more carefully. What they discovered there provided crucial evidence about the scope and sophistication of the arrangement's operations in Tennessee. The tree, which appeared to be a natural landmark, had been modified in subtle ways that were invisible to casual observers but created a sophisticated communication and navigation system. Carved into the bark at various heights were symbols that corresponded to the coded messages found in the Haldenberg house. The symbols were arranged in patterns that provided specific information about routes, schedules, and procedures for anyone who understood the code. The tree essentially functioned as a bulletin board for members of the arrangement, allowing them to leave and receive messages without direct contact. More remarkably, investigators discovered that the root system of the tree had been excavated and modified to create hidden storage compartments. These underground caches contained supplies, documents, and equipment that could support multiple families during extended periods of hiding or travel. The sophistication of the installation suggested that the arrangement had invested considerable time and resources in creating infrastructure that could support its operations for many years. Margaret Crenshaw, whose family operated a small general store at the crossroads 2 miles west of the Haldenberg property, provided additional details about the family's behavior in their final weeks. According to Mrs. Crenshaw, Matthias had visited the store on February 6th to purchase an unusual combination of items: 4 white candles, a bottle of laudanum, a small hand mirror, and a quantity of red sealing wax. He seemed different that day, Mrs. Crenshaw told investigators, calm in a way that wasn't natural for him. Matthias was always a fidgety sort, nervous around people, quick to finish his business and leave. But that day he moved like a man walking in his sleep. When I asked if his family was well, he smiled and said, we're learning to hear what we've been deaf to for so long. The arrangements are nearly complete, and soon we'll be where we truly belong. I didn't know what to make of such talk, but it gave me chills nonetheless. Mrs. Crenshaw also mentioned that she had observed the Haldenberg wagon passing the store on several occasions during January 1883, always late at night and always heading northwest toward the more remote areas of the county. The wagon appeared to carry multiple passengers, but the darkness and distance made it impossible to identify individuals. However, she noted that the wagon was always accompanied by riders on horseback who maintained positions ahead of and behind the vehicle, suggesting that the Haldenbergs were either under escort or being transported under some form of protective supervision. The investigation took on new dimensions when Sheriff Whitmore learned of similar disappearances that had occurred in neighboring counties during the previous decade. Hamilton County's records showed no missing person reports for the Haldenberg family, but inquiries to law enforcement agencies in Bradley, Rhea, and Marion counties revealed a troubling pattern of vanished families and abandoned properties. Between 1873 and 1882, at least 7 families had vanished under circumstances that bore striking similarities to the Haldenberg case. In each instance, the missing families had been recent arrivals to their respective communities, maintained minimal social connections, and left behind carefully prepared homes with no signs of violence or hasty departure. The Bradley County Sheriff's Department provided the most detailed information about one such case. In October 1879, the Kerner family had disappeared from their farm near Cleveland, Tennessee. Like the Haldenbergs, the Kerners were German immigrants who had purchased isolated mountain property and lived quietly for several years before their disappearance. According to the Bradley County files, the Kerner house was found in a state of eerie organization similar to what investigators would later discover at the Haldenberg property. Food was prepared but uneaten, clothing was arranged on beds, and a letter was left explaining the family's departure in terms that referenced a covenant and obligations fulfilled. The Bradley County investigation had uncovered evidence of financial payments made by the Kerner family to an unidentified recipient, documented in ledger entries that matched the pattern found in the Haldenberg documents. The final Kerner payment, like the final Haldenberg payment, was described as settling a family debt and providing release from further obligation. More significantly, the Bradley County investigation had identified a network of underground passages connecting the Kerner property to neighboring farms. These passages, excavated with considerable engineering skill, allowed for movement between widely separated locations without using surface roads or leaving visible tracks. The sophistication of the construction suggested that the arrangement possessed both the technical knowledge and the financial resources necessary for major infrastructure projects. What connected these cases beyond their superficial similarities was the discovery of a loose network of isolated families throughout the Tennessee mountains who appeared to be bound by some form of shared understanding or agreement. Sheriff Whitmore's investigation revealed that many of these families maintained financial relationships with each other, sending money and letters through a network of intermediaries that stretched across multiple counties. The intermediary most frequently mentioned in the various investigations was a man named Conrad Reichert, who operated a small trading post near the Ocoee River in Polk County. Reichert's business records, when finally examined by law enforcement, showed a complex web of financial transactions between dozens of remote mountain families, all involving monthly payments forwarded to recipients identified only by code numbers. Reichert himself proved to be a fascinating figure whose background revealed connections that extended far beyond his modest trading post operation. Born in Bavaria in 1834, he had immigrated to the United States in 1856 and spent several years in Pennsylvania before moving to Tennessee. His immigration documents, discovered in federal archives decades later, showed that he had entered the country under at least 3 different identities, suggesting that he had been using false names since his arrival in America. When questioned by investigators, Reichert initially claimed to operate simply as a banking service for families who preferred to conduct their financial affairs privately. He insisted that he had no knowledge of the specific nature of the arrangements he facilitated, and that his role was limited to receiving money from one party and forwarding it to another according to written instructions. These mountain people value their privacy above all else, Reichert told investigators. They don't trust banks, and they don't trust the government. If a family wants to send money to relatives in Pennsylvania or pay debts to creditors in Georgia, they prefer to do so without creating a paper trail that might attract unwanted attention. I provide that service for a modest fee, nothing more. However, a detailed examination of Reichert's records revealed patterns that suggested something far more organized than simple financial services. The code numbers used to identify payment recipients corresponded to specific geographic locations throughout Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. The amounts of the payments increased over time according to a predetermined schedule, and the timing of the payments aligned with lunar cycles and specific dates that held significance in various European folk traditions. Most disturbing was the discovery that families who had made final payments through Reichert's network had a tendency to disappear shortly thereafter. Of the 43 families documented in Reichert's most recent ledger, 18 had vanished from their homes under circumstances similar to those surrounding the Haldenberg case. Further investigation of Reichert's operation revealed that he maintained correspondence with similar intermediaries throughout the southeastern United States, creating a network that could facilitate the movement of people and money across vast distances without leaving traces in official records. Letters found in his possession contained coded references to relocations, transfers, and final settlements that suggested the arrangement was actively moving families between different regions according to some master plan. The investigation into the Haldenberg disappearance took a dramatic turn when Sheriff Whitmore discovered that several prominent members of the local community had been receiving payments from the arrangement in exchange for maintaining silence about the organization's activities. These payments, documented in financial records seized from Reichert's trading post, revealed that the arrangement had systematically corrupted local law enforcement and government officials to ensure that its operations would not face serious investigation. Among those receiving payments was Dr. Cornelius Hoffman, the physician who had treated Bernhard Krause and other members of families connected to the arrangement. Dr. Hoffman's medical records, examined after his mysterious disappearance in 1884, showed that he had been providing falsified death certificates and medical reports to help families establish new identities. The corruption extended to the county government itself. Records indicated that at least 3 members of the county commission had been receiving monthly payments from the arrangement, and that they had used their influence to ensure that property transfers and tax assessments related to the organization's activities were processed without scrutiny. Most shocking was the discovery that Pastor Heinrich Mueller, despite his apparent concern for the Haldenberg family, had been serving as a communication link between the arrangement and its member families. His pastoral visits to remote properties had provided cover for delivering messages and coordinating activities, while his position as a respected religious leader had helped deflect suspicion from the organization's operations. The investigation into the Haldenberg disappearance effectively ended in the summer of 1883, when Sheriff Whitmore himself disappeared while conducting inquiries in the remote areas of Hamilton County. Deputy Reed found Whitmore's horse and equipment near a creek bed approximately 5 miles from the Haldenberg property, but no trace of the sheriff himself was ever discovered. The circumstances of Sheriff Whitmore's disappearance bore striking similarities to the pattern established by the arrangement's other operations. His personal effects were carefully arranged at the discovery site. His horse was uninjured and properly cared for, and there were no signs of violence or struggle. However, investigators later found evidence that Whitmore had been getting closer to uncovering the true scope of the arrangement's operations in the days before his disappearance. In his final report, filed just 2 days before he vanished, Sheriff Whitmore had documented his discovery of a major gathering that had taken place on the night of June 21, 1883, at a remote location in the mountains. According to his observations, more than 50 people had participated in this gathering, arriving from locations throughout Tennessee and neighboring states. The gathering appeared to be conducting some form of ceremony or ritual, Whitmore wrote in his report. Participants were arranged in precise formations around a central fire, and the proceedings were conducted in a mixture of German and what appeared to be Latin. The purpose of the ceremony was not clear, but it seemed to involve the formal induction of new members into the organization and the assignment of new identities and responsibilities. Sheriff Whitmore's report also described his discovery of a temporary encampment that had been established to support the gathering. The encampment included sophisticated sleeping arrangements, cooking facilities, and storage areas that suggested that the arrangement possessed the resources and organization necessary to support large-scale operations involving hundreds of people. Deputy Reed, apparently shaken by his superior's disappearance and the increasingly strange nature of the case, filed a final report in August 1883 concluding that the Haldenberg family had likely left Tennessee voluntarily and that further investigation would not be productive. However, Reed's private correspondence with his wife, discovered many years later, revealed his true feelings about the case. "I know they took Sheriff Whitmore," Reed wrote to his wife in a letter dated August 15, 1883. "The same people who made the Haldenberg family disappear have now silenced the one man who was getting close to exposing their operations. I've been ordered to close the case, and I intend to follow those orders. This is not something that a county sheriff's department can handle alone. These people have resources and connections that reach into the highest levels of government, and they will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their secrecy." The case was officially closed, and the Haldenberg property was sold at public auction to pay taxes and settle the estate according to the instructions found in the cellar. However, the buyer of the property, a lumber company from Chattanooga, encountered immediate difficulties when they attempted to develop the land for timber harvesting. Workers sent to survey the property reported discovering extensive underground installations that had not been apparent during the initial investigation. These installations included not only the communication and storage facilities that had been identified earlier, but also living quarters that could have housed dozens of people for extended periods. The underground complex was far more sophisticated than anything that should have been possible to construct in such a remote location with the technology available in the 1880s. The passages were lined with carefully fitted stone. The ventilation systems allowed for comfortable occupation even during winter months, and the storage areas contained supplies that could have supported a large community for months without outside assistance. Most disturbing was the discovery of a large chamber that appeared to have been used for meetings or ceremonies involving substantial numbers of people. The chamber contained permanent seating arrangements, a raised platform for speakers or leaders, and acoustic features that allowed for clear communication throughout the space. For the next 15 years, the Haldenberg property remained largely unoccupied due to the difficulties encountered by anyone who attempted to work on the land. Several families attempted to purchase and settle on the property, but none remained for more than a few months. Complaints to local authorities typically involved reports of strange noises emanating from the underground installations during nighttime hours, the discovery of personal belongings that had been carefully arranged in unnatural patterns, and an overwhelming sense of being observed by unseen watchers. In 1898, The property was purchased by a consortium of investors from Chattanooga who planned to develop the land for timber harvesting despite the reported difficulties. The development project required a detailed survey of the property, including excavation around the foundation of the original house to determine its structural integrity and to map the extent of the underground installations. During this excavation, workers discovered that the underground complex was even more extensive than previous investigations had revealed. The system of passages and chambers extended for more than a mile in each direction from the original house, connecting to similar installations on at least 6 other properties in the surrounding area. The workers also discovered a series of underground chambers that had been carefully concealed beneath the house. These chambers were accessed through a narrow tunnel that began in the cellar and extended approximately 50 feet into the hillside behind the property. The tunnel and chambers showed evidence of regular human occupation, including sleeping areas, food storage, and what appeared to be meeting spaces designed to accommodate large groups. More disturbing was the discovery of extensive documentation hidden within the underground chambers. Wooden crates contained thousands of letters, financial records, and handwritten documents that detailed the activities of what appeared to be a secret organization spanning multiple states and involving hundreds of families over several decades. The documents revealed that the organization, which referred to itself simply as the Arrangement, operated as a mutual aid society for immigrant families seeking to escape persecution or legal difficulties in their countries of origin. However, the documents also revealed that the arrangement had evolved far beyond its original humanitarian purposes to become something more resembling a criminal organization that controlled its members through a combination of financial incentives and threats of exposure. Families who joined the arrangement received financial assistance, help with establishing new identities, and protection from law enforcement agencies that might be seeking them for various reasons. In exchange for these services, families were required to make monthly payments to support the organization, agree to relocate or disappear entirely if their continued presence in a given location was deemed to threaten the security of the network, and surrender all ties to their previous identities and relationships. The document suggested that the arrangement maintained safe houses and relocation facilities throughout the American frontier, allowing families to vanish from one location and reappear in another with complete new identities. However, the organization also maintained strict control over its members, monitoring their activities and punishing any attempts to leave the network or contact relatives from their previous lives. The Haldenberg family's involvement with the arrangement dated back to their arrival in Tennessee in 1881, but the documents reveal that their relationship with the organization had begun much earlier, possibly while they were still in Europe. According to the discovered papers, Caspar Haldenberg had been fleeing prosecution in Prussia related to his involvement in revolutionary political activities, and the arrangement had provided him with assistance in escaping to America. However, the assistance came with obligations that extended far beyond simple financial payments. The documents indicated that families who received help from the arrangement were expected to serve the organization's interests for the remainder of their lives, participating in whatever activities were required and accepting relocation or elimination if circumstances demanded such measures. The documents indicated that the arrangement had decided in early 1883 that several Tennessee families, including the Haldenbergs, needed to be relocated due to increased scrutiny from law enforcement agencies. However, rather than simply moving to new locations, some families were designated for what the documents referred to as final resolution, a euphemism that suggested something far more sinister than relocation. According to the papers found in the underground chambers, the Haldenberg family had been successfully relocated to a new settlement in the Oregon Territory, where they were living under different names and identities. However, other documents suggested that some families had been eliminated rather than relocated, particularly those who had expressed reluctance to continue serving the arrangement's interests, or who had attempted to leave the organization. The discovery of these documents created a significant problem for the Chattanooga investors, who realized that their property purchase had inadvertently exposed them to a criminal conspiracy that spanned multiple states and potentially involved federal law enforcement agencies. Rather than report their discoveries to authorities, the investors chose to seal the underground chambers, burn the documents, and abandon their development plans. However, not all of the documents were destroyed. Several crates of papers were secretly removed by workers who recognized their potential historical value, and these documents eventually found their way to private collectors and researchers who spent decades trying to piece together the full scope of the arrangement's operations. The property was quietly sold to a local farmer named Samuel Morrison, who was told only that the land was unsuitable for development due to unstable soil conditions. Morrison used the land for grazing and never entered the main house, which gradually fell into disrepair and was eventually demolished in 1923. However, Morrison's family reported strange incidents on the property for many years, including the discovery of underground entrances that appeared and disappeared according to no apparent pattern. In 1934, a former law enforcement officer named Lieutenant Colonel James Brennan published a memoir in which he described his involvement in a federal investigation of immigrant smuggling networks during the 1880s. Brennan's memoir, titled Hidden Trails, a lawman's account of the secret underground, devoted an entire chapter to what he called the Tennessee disappearances. According to Brennan, federal authorities had been aware of the arrangement's activities for several years, but had been unable to infiltrate the organization or locate its leadership. The federal investigation had been prompted by reports from multiple state law enforcement agencies about families who vanished without trace, leaving behind evidence of financial connections to unknown entities. The patterns were too consistent and widespread to be coincidental, suggesting the existence of an organized network with significant resources and sophisticated operational procedures. However, the investigation had been complicated by the fact that many local law enforcement officials were either intimidated by the organization or were actively cooperating with its operations in exchange for financial compensation. Brennan's account provided details that had not been included in the local investigations conducted by county sheriffs. According to federal records, the arrangement was believed to be connected to similar organizations operating throughout the American frontier, all designed to help immigrants avoid legal difficulties or persecution by creating new identities and establishing them in remote communities. However, Brennan's memoir also revealed that the federal investigation had uncovered evidence of far more sinister activities than simple identity changes. The organizations were suspected of involvement in human trafficking, forced labor, and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable immigrant families who had sought help in escaping persecution. The organizations operated through a network of trusted intermediaries who handled financial transactions, communications, and logistics for families seeking to disappear. These intermediaries were often legitimate business people who maintained their regular occupations while secretly facilitating the activities of the network. However, the intermediaries also served as enforcers who ensured that families who received assistance continued to serve the organization's interests and did not attempt to leave or expose its operations. Brennan's memoir suggested that the arrangement had been particularly successful in Tennessee due to the state's rough terrain and sparse population, which provided ideal conditions for hidden communities and clandestine transportation routes. The organization had reportedly established several permanent settlements in remote areas where disappeared families could live safely under new identities, but these settlements functioned more like labor camps than free communities. According to Brennan, the federal investigation had identified at least 12 such settlements in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. each housing between 50 and 100 people who had officially disappeared from their previous lives. The settlements were completely self-sufficient, with their own schools, workshops, and governance systems, but they were also completely isolated from the outside world and subject to strict control by arrangement overseers. The investigation had been complicated by the fact that many of the families in these settlements appeared to be content with their situations, making it difficult for federal authorities to characterize the organization's activities as purely criminal. However, Brennan's account suggested that this apparent contentment was maintained through a combination of propaganda, isolation, and threats against family members who might attempt to leave. The federal investigation had also uncovered evidence that the arrangement was connected to similar organizations in Europe, suggesting that it was part of an international network that helped people escape persecution while simultaneously exploiting their desperation for its own purposes. The European connections explained how the organization had been able to recruit members before they even arrived in America, and how it maintained the resources necessary for such extensive operations. Brennan's memoir indicated that the federal investigation had been quietly abandoned in the late 1880s due to shifting political priorities and the practical difficulty of prosecuting an organization whose activities primarily consisted of helping people disappear voluntarily. However, Brennan also suggested that the investigation had been terminated due to political pressure from individuals who had financial interests in maintaining the arrangement's operations. The settlements continued to exist, but gradually integrated with mainstream society as the frontier period ended and the need for such extreme measures diminished. However, Brennan's account suggested that some elements of the arrangement continued to operate well into the 20th century, adapting their methods to changing circumstances, but maintaining their basic structure and objectives. The final documented reference to the Haldenberg case appeared in a 1962 academic paper published by Dr. Elizabeth Morrison of Vanderbilt University's Department of Anthropology. Morrison, who was conducting research on German immigrant communities in Tennessee, had discovered references to the case in the personal papers of Pastor Heinrich Müller, which had been donated to the university following the pastor's death in 1923. Dr. Morrison's paper, titled Hidden Communities, German Immigrant Networks, 19th Century Tennessee, presented the Haldenberg case as an example of the elaborate support systems that immigrant communities created to protect themselves from persecution and legal difficulties. Her research had uncovered evidence that similar networks existed throughout the American frontier, helping thousands of families establish new lives under new identities. However, Dr. Morrison's research also revealed disturbing aspects of these networks that suggested they had evolved beyond their original humanitarian purposes. Financial records and personal testimonies indicated that the networks had become increasingly commercialized over time, charging substantial fees for their services and potentially exploiting the desperation of families seeking help. More troubling were reports of families who had attempted to leave the network's settlements after establishing new lives, only to discover that their relocation agreements were considered permanent and binding. Several documented cases suggested that people who tried to return to mainstream society or contact relatives from their previous lives faced intimidation, threats, and, in some cases, complete disappearance. Dr. Morrison's paper noted that the line between assistance and exploitation had apparently become blurred within these networks, transforming what had begun as mutual aid societies into something more closely resembling criminal organizations that trafficked in human beings under the guise of providing protection and assistance. The paper also revealed that Dr. Morrison had attempted to locate descendants of the Haldenberg family and other families who had disappeared through these networks. Her research had identified several individuals living in Western states whose family histories and genealogical records suggested connections to the disappeared Tennessee families, But attempts to interview these individuals had been unsuccessful. According to Dr. Morrison's notes, potential descendants either claimed no knowledge of their family histories or refused to discuss their backgrounds, suggesting that the secrecy imposed by the arrangement continued to influence families decades after their initial relocations. In some cases, families appeared to maintain active connections to networks that might represent continued versions of the original organizations. Dr. Morrison's academic career ended abruptly in 1963 when she disappeared while conducting field research in rural East Tennessee. Her research materials were never recovered, and no trace of her was ever found, despite extensive searches by university officials and law enforcement agencies. The circumstances of her disappearance bore striking similarities to the cases she had been researching, leading some to speculate that her investigation had attracted unwanted attention from surviving elements of the networks she was studying. The final official investigation related to the Haldenberg case occurred in 1965, when federal agents investigating organized crime activities in the southeastern United States discovered evidence that some elements of the arrangement continued to operate under different names and organizational structures. However, this investigation was also terminated without public explanation, and the agents involved were reassigned to other duties. In the decades since Dr. Morrison's disappearance, the story of the Haldenberg family has become part of local folklore in Hamilton County. Tour guides at Signal Mountain occasionally mention the case as an example of the mysterious events that occurred in the area during the frontier period, but the details are typically sanitized and presented as harmless historical curiosities, rather than documented evidence of organized criminal activity. The site where the Haldenberg house once stood is now part of a small residential development built in the 1970s. Several families have lived on the property over the years, and while most have experienced no unusual incidents, some have reported minor oddities such as cold spots in certain rooms, the occasional sound of footsteps in unoccupied areas, and the discovery of small objects that appear to have been deliberately buried in the yard. However, residents of the development have noted more significant discoveries during landscaping and construction projects. These items, including old bottles, metal tools, and fragments of pottery, are consistent with 19th century household goods, but show signs of having been carefully buried rather than simply discarded. More intriguing is the fact that many of these buried items contain hidden compartments or concealed messages that suggest they were part of a communication system used by the arrangement. Recent genealogical research conducted by amateur historians has identified individuals living in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California whose family histories and DNA markers are consistent with descent from the disappeared Haldenberg family. These individuals, when contacted by researchers, have expressed surprise at the suggestion that their ancestors might have been involved in organized disappearances. But several have acknowledged family stories about relatives who started over in the Western Territories under circumstances that were never fully explained. More significantly, some of these potential descendants have reported that their families continue to maintain traditions and practices that appear to originate from the arrangement's operations. These practices include specific dates for family gatherings, ritualistic destruction of personal documents, and financial contributions to organizations whose purposes are not clearly explained to participants. One particularly intriguing lead emerged in 2018 when a property developer in Portland, Oregon, discovered a cache of documents while renovating a house that had been built in 1889. The documents, hidden in a sealed cavity within the house's foundation, included letters written in German that referenced the Tennessee arrangement and the great relocation that had brought the letter writer's family to Oregon. The letters, which were translated by German language specialists at Portland State University, described a highly organized operation that had relocated dozens of families from Tennessee to pre-established communities in Oregon during the 1880s. However, the letters also described restrictions and obligations that continued to govern the relocated families long after their arrival in their new homes. According to the translated letters, families who had been relocated were required to maintain complete secrecy about their previous lives and were forbidden from contacting relatives or friends from their old communities. The letters suggested that these restrictions were enforced through a system of mutual surveillance, with families reporting on each other to ensure compliance with the organization's security requirements. The Portland discovery has prompted renewed interest in the Haldenberg case among researchers studying immigration patterns and frontier settlement history. However, attempts to locate additional documentation or physical evidence related to the arrangement have been largely unsuccessful, suggesting that the organization was highly effective at concealing its operations and destroying evidence of its activities. What remains of the Haldenberg story serves as a reminder that the American frontier period involved far more complex social and economic relationships than typically portrayed in popular histories. The networks that helped families like the Haldenbergs disappear and establish new lives represented a parallel society that operated largely outside the awareness of mainstream legal and governmental institutions, but which also created opportunities for exploitation and control that may have persisted long beyond the frontier period. The documented cases of families who disappeared through such networks represent only a fraction of the people whose lives were shaped by these hidden systems of mutual aid and social control. The careful disappearance of the Haldenberg family from their house in the Tennessee mountains remains a window into a hidden America where the line between assistance and exploitation, between freedom and control, was often drawn by people whose motivations and methods remained largely unknown to history. On quiet evenings, when the wind moves through the trees that have grown up around the modern development, residents occasionally report hearing sounds that seem to echo from an earlier time: the creak of wagon wheels on frozen ground, the whisper of voices speaking in a language that few in Tennessee would have understood, and the soft closing of doors that lead to places no map has ever shown. Whether these sounds represent actual echoes of past events or simply the natural acoustics of a landscape shaped by human hopes and fears, they serve as subtle reminders that some stories refuse to remain completely buried, and that the silence surrounding the Haldenberg family's disappearance continues to hold secrets that may never be fully revealed.